Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and for that very kind introduction. It was worth coming to hear that, if not my speech, for me anyway. My topic today is black holes to surplus budgets. And so I want to just start by explaining what the so-called black hole was. And then that will be a little technical, but bear with me if you would, and then try and draw some lessons, including lessons for today, from how we approached that and what we might even do today. I don't believe I was the person that coined the phrase black hole. I haven't had enough time to research this, but I'll give this research task to Tom Frame. I actually think it was probably Tim Fisher that came up with it, and I remember that because I was very angry when he did. I didn't think there was a black hole. I didn't think something had been there and just disappeared into nothing. I thought it was much more morally reprehensible than that, what had actually happened, and I'll come back to you that in a moment. The last budget before the March 1996 election was Ralph Willis's 1995 budget. He declared, "The budget delivers a surplus of $718 million," and went on, and these were the key words. Importantly, for 1996-7, that's the next year, that's the year that the incoming government would face as its first budget year. Importantly, quote, "the budget for 1996-7 will be in surplus, excluding asset sales and special debt and capital repayments. And the budget surplus in the following year, which was 8-9, will be $7.4 billion or 1.2% of GDP. The budget contained as its first and most important chart 1, this is the 95 budget, showing budget surpluses growing over the forward estimates in every year from that budget year on. Now, one had to be careful about these sorts of claims because in those days the Commonwealth reported what was called a headline balance. If it sold an asset, the full amount of the proceeds were put on the budget bottom line. Believe it or not, an asset sale was treated as a negative outlay, a reduction in expenditure. You wouldn't get away with it these days. So when Willis said we're selling our remaining equity in the Commonwealth Bank and we'll do it in 2 tranches, and one of those tranches will be in 95 and one will be in 1997, you knew the budget was being padded by the asset sale of the Commonwealth Bank. But the important thing is the year in between, 6-7, there was to be no asset sale. And Willis had gone out of his way to say it would be a surplus, quote, excluding asset sales and special debt and capital repayments. In other words, it would be an underlying surplus, what we now report as the key budget measure. It would be a real budget surplus. Now, the election was due in the early months of 1996. And the last update of that budget was given by Ralph Willis on the 21st of December 95. So you've got to imagine we're all having holidays such as you have before an election is called, and Ralph comes out with his budget update, and I actually brought it here just to show that accounting wasn't in those days what it is now. That's the budget, what we would now call a MyEFO. It was the 3-page press release with a table on each of 2 pages. And it made no mention of the forward estimates. It only applied to that current budget year, 95-96. We introduced a thing, and I'll come back to it, called MyEFO. This was the first MyEFO I did. It's 100 pages. It listed every decision between the budget and the half year, and it updated not just the budget year but the forward estimates. So whenever you get a MyEFO these days, it'll not be just this year, but it'll be the forward estimates, which is the current year and 3 years after it. Willis confirmed in that mid-year update the budget would still be in surplus for the 95 year because the Victorian government had repaid some debt. Now, again, it's weird to think, but this is the way things were done in those days. If the Victorian government paid debt to the Commonwealth, that went on the bottom line. That was a negative outlay. That was an expenditure cut. Jeff Kennett's early repayment of debt saved the budget surplus in 1995-96. Some people thought he might have done it deliberately, but that was the way the accounting went in those days. Willis made no update of the year that really counted, which would be the incoming year of 1996, 1997, and a month later the election was called. During the election campaign on the 10th of February, I wrote to Willis and the Secretary of Treasury asking them if they still stood by their 1995 budgets for the forthcoming year, the 96 year. The Treasury Secretary, Ted Evans, replied saying this is just a matter for the government. Willis replied saying it's never been done before and we see no reason to change well-established policy on this matter. So that's where things were. It was February of 1996. The government had said there would be a budget surplus in 96-97, excluding asset sales, excluding capital repayments. That was the official ground on which the 96 election was fought. During the campaign, Prime Minister Keating reaffirmed that the budget was projected to be in surplus. Finance Minister Beazley said on the 1st of February, we're operating in surplus and our projections are for surpluses in the future. The Treasury estimates that we had in connection with the last budget, and they were Treasury estimates, they stand for good and we stand by them. That was in February of 1996. Well, the election was held on the 2nd of March. On the 4th of March, I flew to Sydney for briefings with the Treasury. John Howard was there being briefed by PM&C. I was presented with the Blue Book. As you know, during an election campaign, the public service starts preparing a brief for the incoming government as to what they should do with their policies. It's a red book for Labor and a blue book for the Coalition. My blue book ran to 300 to 400 pages, but lest I didn't get the main point of it, the cover of the blue book had a graph on the front, and I thought I'd bring this today. This is my blue book. As you can see, briefing folder number 1. At least the Treasury gave me the number 1 copy of the blue book. And that was on the front page in the ring binder, just so you didn't miss it. I showed you growing budget surpluses, which was the 1995 budget, and I looked at this graph. Nothing's in surplus. Not the current year, not the next year, not the year after. Nothing before 2000 is actually in surplus. And, you know, I could tell within a moment of looking at that was not the graph that had been in the 1995 budget. As I say, you know, it's a big ring binder with policies on everything. This is just stuck on the front of it, which indicated that the Treasury thought that was the most important message to get in my thick skull that particular day, which they did. According to the Blue Book, the starting point was a deficit of $7.6 billion, or 1.5% of GDP. 1.5% of GDP would be a budget deficit of $26 billion today. In fact, the current forecast for the current budget year is 1.6% of GDP. So, pretty close to where we are today was the news that the Treasury delivered. We decided we'd put the budget back to August, not May, to August, so we could spend the whole of the winter working on the budget. And for me, it was a very lean and cold winter, I can tell you. By the time the budget was delivered in August, the Treasury said that the deficit on a no policy change basis would have been 9.6 billion, 2% of GDP. So the famous black hole was either 8 billion if you went with the March estimate, or it was 10 billion if you went with the August deficit. And when you go back and look at the literature, some people were claiming it was 8, some it's 10. That's how you reconciled those two figures. What was the opposition's response? Varied over the years. Sometimes Labor claimed there was no black hole, never had been, that this had been conjured up for political advantage. This was Beazley's initial response. But how I tricked the Treasury into drawing up these figures before I become Treasurer was something that was never explained on this theory. I can tell you in March '96, when the Blue Book was given to me, Ted Evans knew a lot more about budgets than I did, and it was well above my ability to pull one over him. They were the Treasury's figures, not mine. Some in the press took a different tack. They said, oh well, this was not new news. Everyone knew the budget was in deficit anyway. On this theory, we merely pretended to be taken by surprise so we could cut expenditure more drastically than promised. So let me say clearly, on the contrary, everybody did not know. I did not know. Most in the press had been lauding the government for its fiscal policy to balance the budget, and then said afterwards, oh, everyone knew it wasn't balanced anyway. And I can tell you from opposition, I certainly had no capacity to second-guess the Treasury figures and no reason to doubt their integrity. And this is the key point. This outcome did not suit me, and it did not suit the government. We had hoped that we'd have a budget in surplus and we could fund our policies and keep the budget in surplus. Now we were being told we had to find $8 billion in savings before we could start. You know, it's imagine, you know, you're going to run 400 metres and you walk to the starting line, all of a sudden they say your starting line's 80 metres back here. We had to get the $8 billion to get to where we were and then fund our promises out of cuts to spending. We did not have a majority in the Senate, and we should be clear about one thing: we were given no quarter by our opponents. The idea that in the old days opposition cooperated to allow a government to implement its policy is fantasy. Labor fought every expenditure cut and eked out every vote it could. I'm not saying they weren't entitled to, they were entitled to, but it wasn't easy. On the eve of the budget, the ACTU organised a huge rally outside the new Parliament House. Bill Kelty had promised that the government would be given the full symphony. He was a master of the idiom, Bill. We'll give them the full symphony. The protest rally was addressed by Kim Beazley, the Labor leader, and Cheryl Curnow, the Democrat leader. That was interesting too. Didn't quite know why at that point. The crowd was whipped into a frenzy. Some trade union militants stormed Parliament House. The security guards couldn't hold the doors. They smashed through the front doors, left blood on the floor. Bodyguards in the building grabbed us all. They grabbed me. They put me in a locked room. And they said after a few hours I was allowed out because they'd cleared the building. I don't think Parliament House has ever been physically stormed in that way. Well, certainly not since, and I'm not sure that it was ever physically stormed in that way before. Now, the only reason I tell you that is this was controversial. You look back at it all and say, oh, well, it was all very easy, you know. I mean, people were storming Parliament House and smashed through the doors. As it turned out, I think that rebounded against the opposition. I think the public saw this violence at Parliament House and said, well, you know, whatever you think of these expenditure cuts, that the Parliament shouldn't be taken over by demonstrators and by rabble. I delivered the budget the next day and said these words: "Our predecessors had Australia on a path of deficit and debt to the next century. Our government could not stand back and ignore the problem. Although we did not create it, we will take responsibility to fix it." The plan was to close the budget deficit of 2% over 2 years, cutting outlays 1.8% of GDP and increasing revenues 0.2% of GDP. The historical record shows that over 2 years outlays were cut 1.7 and revenues rose 0.4. The budget balanced over 2 years. It balanced in 1997-98. The only time there had been a fiscal consolidation anything like that had been 1987 to 1990 under Keating, but it proved unsustainable. The budget plunged back into deep deficit. There has been no comparable fiscal consolidation since. The 2% deficit was too big to close in 1 year, so the first budget, our first budget, was a deficit. Over 12 years, there would only be one other. That was in 2001-2, a very small deficit, 0.1% of GDP. It's outside the timeline of this conference, so I'll not dwell on it in detail here, but put simply, it was a mild downturn internationally, the tech wreck, and domestically, the introduction of the GST, and the unexpected expenditure of going to war in Afghanistan and measures against terrorism in the wake of the September 11 attacks, which we hadn't expected at the time of the budget. A line of revisionism we began to hear when Labor was having trouble balancing budgets a decade later was the coalition only balanced budgets out of rivers of revenue flowing from the mining boom. So, for the record, the mining boom peaked in 2011. A lot of Australians wouldn't know that, when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister. Just for a temporary spike, but it went to $180 a tonne. The budget was in deficit. The iron ore price today is $60 a tonne. The budget is in deficit. When I delivered the Coalition's first balanced budget in 1997, the iron ore price was $13 a tonne. It was still around that mark in 2001. Commodity prices were in fact very depressed. This was the time of the tech boom. Nobody wanted to be in the old economy, 1990-2000. It wasn't until 2005 that mining prices began to rise significantly. By then the government had already delivered 7 surplus budgets. One of the things that arose out of this experience, I think, that has not been adequately recognised is the Charter of Budget Honesty. I'd pledged this after Ralph Willis had delivered that 1995 budget. Labor strongly attacked it when we were in government, but we ultimately enacted it in 1998. We started operating under it before it was passed. We ultimately enacted it in 1998. The Charter of Budget Honesty, by law, and you've got to remember there was no law up until that point that governed how budgets were presented. There was an executive act. So the government of the day could decide these things. There was no parliamentary law that governed them. The Charter of Budget Honesty requires a mid-year update of all information in the budget, including all decisions, economic forecasts, and importantly, fiscal outlook across the forward estimates. That's what we hadn't been able to get out of Treasury or Ralph Willis. It also requires the Secretaries of Treasury and Finance to give a pre-election statement. Not the ministers, the secretaries. And that's called PFO, the pre-election statement of economic and fiscal outlook. It also allows oppositions to have, if they wish to, their policy costed by the central agencies. Since 1996, because of the Charter of Budget Honesty, the parties have never gone into an election without knowing the state of the books as revealed by the secretaries, not the ministers, the secretaries of Treasury and Finance. The Charter stands 20 years later, virtually unamended. It has proven its worth in 7 elections, 20 budgets, 20 MyEFOs, 20 final budget outcomes. It also lays down the requirement for the intergenerational report, and it also requires a government to set a fiscal policy goal. The goal of every government since ours has been the same. It's the one I laid down, that the government should balance the budget over the course of the economic cycle. Unfortunately, the Charter cannot enforce a government to meet its fiscal target. So the last Labor budget in 1995 had payments to GDP at 25.6%. In 2 years, we pushed them down to 23.9%. There's then a break in the series with the introduction of GST in 2001. So when we introduced the GST, it was to take over the collection of state excise and duties, which had been rendered invalid by the High Court, and to apply part of that money to the states so they could abolish financial institutions duty, bank account debits, tax and other things. If you treat the GST as a Commonwealth tax, which I never regarded it as, what this has the effect of doing is saying the states cut their taxes and the Commonwealth increased theirs. In fact, the Commonwealth merely replaced the state taxes. But if you account for it in that way, it actually bumps up the Commonwealth tax to GDP revenue. And when the Commonwealth remits the money back to the states, that's treated as a payment. So it looks as if the Commonwealth's increasing its expenditure by sending money to the states. Collecting their taxes and paying it to the states produces increased Commonwealth tax revenue, increased Commonwealth payment, reduced state tax and reduced state payments. So there's a break in the series. And after the introduction of the GST, because of that break in the series, both the payment and the spending go up again. Never mind, they went up because of that change in accounting treatment to 25.1% in 2000, and over the next 7 years we were able to get them down again by another 2% to 23.1%. As is well known, in response to the financial crisis of 2008, Rudd and Swan increased payments to 26%. They've never come back to the pre-crisis levels. If we could get them back to the pre-crisis levels, the budget would now be in surplus rather than $30 billion in deficit. In fact, the budget today looks very like it did in 1996-7. So let me come in my closing, Tom, to 4 or 5 interesting points. What did balancing the budget do for the government? Well, it gave it what I would say its primary mission in the first term. Other issues arose, of course, like guns, and you have to attend to those. But what was the abiding policy mission of the government in its first term? It was to balance the budget. A balanced budget is a natural line. Once you admit that a deficit doesn't matter, it becomes an argument about how big a deficit matters. If 10 billion doesn't matter, does 20 billion matter? 20 billion doesn't matter, does 30 billion matter? If 30 billion doesn't matter, does 50 billion? I mean, a balanced budget is a natural line. Something you can explain to colleagues, and it's something you can explain to the public. The second thing I'd say that the commitment to a balanced budget did is it gave the government the ability to represent back to the lobby groups what it was doing rather than let the lobby groups represent to the government. You know, there are many ministers who feel if I'm the Minister for Agriculture, my job is to get money for farmers. If I'm the Minister for Tourism, my job is to get money for tourist operators. If I'm the Minister for Industry, my job is to get money for car manufacturers. And they're all representing sectional interests to the government. The fact that the government had a very firm line, balanced budget, allowed the government to represent back to them. We may not be able to do this because we have this overwhelming and unifying objective. And I think it gave us the capacity to elevate national interest over sectional interest. You'll recall when Malcolm Turnbull challenged Tony Abbott for the leadership of the Liberal Party in September 2015, he said the party had been unable to develop an economic narrative. No one could ever have missed the clear economic narrative of the Howard government. We are going to balance the budget. We are going to pay down Labor's debt. After that, we will reduce tax. It was a unifying narrative. The third point I'll make is it allowed us to have ministerial discipline. The most dispiriting thing for a minister is if they take the flak in their portfolio for cutting spending and they see some other hero take the benefit for increasing spending. That is completely and utterly dispiriting for a minister, and they won't come with you in relation to that. If you have an objective, you can discipline them all around that objective. And we were able to say truthfully to ministers their proposals were not affordable. They were not affordable if we had a budget balance. If we'd been prepared to live with a $20 billion deficit, they were quite affordable. If we'd been prepared to live with a $30 billion, even more would have been affordable. If we'd been prepared to live with a $50 billion, it would have been a free-for-all. So it gave you the opportunity to have ministerial discipline. The fourth thing is, I would say, politically, I think this did enormous damage to Kim Beazley. I think he'd been put into the finance department to toughen him up for the leadership, and far from it being a qualification for office, I think it proved an enormous millstone around his neck. He thereafter had trouble convincing people he could be trusted with money. And my own view is the damage that this did to Beazley was a major reason why we won not just in '98, but also in 2001. By 2004, we were up against Mark Latham. He had baggage, but it wasn't financial baggage. But even so, he seriously worried the government. In my view, the government spent too much in the 2004 election campaign. I remember saying to John Howard afterwards that I was worrying about the finances, and his response was, well, I wasn't going to die wondering, which was, I think, an admission that we're going to throw everything we could at the 2004 election. The last point I'd make is this. If you're going to ask the public to tighten their belts and engage in cost cutting, you've got to be able to tell them there'll be a benefit. I mean, what is the point of cost cutting and belt tightening forever? In our case, we put the argument like this. If we cut costs and balance the budget and the government doesn't call on the capital markets, your interest rates will be lower. Point number one. And that actually was true. That was the experience. Interest rates fell, GST came in, they went up again, interest rates fell again. The other thing we put to them was, if you go through this period of belt tightening and cost cutting, the reward will also be we can have lower taxes. And that's why I always believed we had to deliver on lower taxes. You couldn't say to people, tighten your belts for 7 years. Oh, and by the way, you can't have any benefit on your taxes now because there's another 7 years to go. I mean, you actually have to hold out some prospect for people if you want to take them with you. And so there are some people that say we shouldn't have cut taxes. I would say that was the whole object of balancing the budget, so we could cut taxes. I'd put it completely the other way around. The longer term point was that good fiscal policy strengthened the Commonwealth balance sheet. We had no debt by 2006. We'd established the Future Fund. We were growing an asset position. We'd had 2 upgrades in our credit rating. Of course, the spending that started in 2008 meant that all the debt we'd paid off was reborrowed again. People often ask whether it was worth paying off the debt, given that subsequent governments have gone out and borrowed it all back. The only answer I can give is to say this: just imagine where we'd be if we hadn't have paid it off. Sure, subsequent governments have piled on debt, but if we hadn't got the Commonwealth debt free, they would have piled debt on debt, not debt on a clean slate. Even today, Australian government net debt is much lower than comparable countries. Our fiscal journey over the last 10 years has been bad, but the starting point was extremely strong. And it was the starting point that gave us the ability to weather the 2008 storm. Thank you all very much.
If you care to ask a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone to arrive, let us know who you are, and then we'll look forward to your question. And there's a question over here.
There was one over here.
Just here first. Look, we'll go here and there. And one
Peter, given that parliamentarians and Treasury don't seem to know what shape the budget will be in on Tuesday, and we are having projections that go out decades now, what do you think is a fair income forecast for a budget figure, and are these figures of decades worth the paper they're written on?
No, of course they're not worth the paper they're written on. The idea that somebody can tell you what the budget balance will be in 2027 is a fantasy. And I agree with you. As the forecasts for the immediate years got worse and worse, the Treasury said, oh, that's okay, we'll push them out further because they'll get better and better. Can't be the case. So I never tried to do 10-year things. I think it's a joke, really. But I do believe in the forward estimates, you know, that'll give you 1 year plus what they would call a forecast for the next year plus 2 years of projections. That will give you some idea of direction, but anyone who's going to bet their house on where the budget will be in 2027 deserves everything they've got coming for them.
Hi, Scott Brenton, University of Melbourne. I want to be slightly critical, but I'll start by saying that I don't dismiss that compared to all the treasurers that have come after you, that you clearly stand out, but that's quite a low bar, if I might say. But could I just get you to reflect maybe a bit critically, like what didn't you do so well during this time? And maybe provide a prompt. So we're looking at this image of the GST negotiations, and indeed for outsiders, they seem to think that it was Howard that was the better negotiator and was kind of like, well, look, let them have food, and ultimately that did make it more politically palatable, but you tended to be more the hardliner. Is that a fair assessment? Or, I mean, what didn't you perhaps do so well whilst during this period?
Well, as I said to you, I thought we got lax after the 2004 election. And I did everything I could then to try and maintain some discipline. Now, you know, that to me, I would say was a failure. There were colleagues of mine that would say, well, why were you worrying about all these budget surpluses? I mean, we'd paid off debt, you know. It was our money to spend for votes. All you did is you sat back and we lost the 2007 election and you let people come in and spend a whole lot more. So I'm critical of myself. Would other people be critical? I don't know. On the GST, you've got to remember this. We had won an election on the promise to put a GST on food. It wasn't just a theory. We'd actually won that election. Now, you know, we were going for broke. I think everybody would say to you today, the GST would be better if it were on a broader base. I think everyone would say that to you. I think even the Labor Party would say that today. And there are people that are saying you should broaden the base and, you know, we get pieces from ex-Labor ministers, should broaden the base, should increase the rate. You know, I was fighting for the best possible GST we could. Right. Now, in the end, we couldn't get it through the Senate and we had to negotiate with Meg Lees. But I'll tell you this, if we'd have walked into that cabinet room, and I was in the cabinet room for all those days, and said, Meg, tell us what you want, it would be far worse than it is today. I mean, we had to argue the case. Now, people say to me today, oh, well, you know, the GST is not as good as it should have been. And it's not. It's not. It would have been better if we'd have managed to get more of our policy through, but at least we got something through. So, I mean, I must say to you, being ambitious for policy outcomes, I don't regard as a weakness. And I would put to you the counterfactual. If somebody, you know, hadn't have been as ambitious as at the time, maybe the outcomes would have been that much weaker than they in fact were. But, you know, having said all of that, did I make mistakes? Yes, I've made too many of them to actually enumerate here.
And one quick one to end.
Andrew Blythe, UNSW Canberra. Peter, if I can take you back to 1996, you're 21 years old, you're treasurer, you're...
I wasn't 21.
Close to it. But my question is, given we're the Public Leadership Research Group, what efforts, if any, are made to develop leaders within political parties? And the second part of my question is, what do you think are essential qualities for those involved in public leadership?
Well, you know, I would say there's always a tension in politics between doing what you feel you've got to do to get there and doing what you know is right. And this is always the trade-off, right? Some people would just say, look, you know, don't worry about balanced budgets. You know, we won't be able to do anything if we're not re-elected. Just get out there and spend the money and win the votes. And there is an element of truth that if you do fail to win the votes, you won't be able to do anything. But if all you're interested in doing is winning the votes, you won't be able to do anything either. And so it's this trade-off, I feel, between what's practical and what's possible. And, you know, I've always believed that you ought to go into anything, whether it's a business negotiation or whether it's an exam or, you know, whether it's setting up a study centre, you ought to go into anything, you know, with an ambitious agenda because you'll only ever be cut back. Nobody's ever going to walk into you and say, I would like to raise you by 2 or 3, you know, so you might as well start as high as you possibly can and they'll cut you back from there. That's always been my view. And I think we were able to do that. I mean, as I said, you know, I think as the years go by, it's harder and harder to maintain that energy and that discipline. You asked me about what's being done to develop leaders. Well, not much. I don't think much has been done to develop leaders, but can anything be done? You know, can you produce a leader from a leadership school?
Yes.
All right. Okay. I give Tom the last word. He wins. Thanks very much.
Would you please thank Mr. Costello?